Senators, thank you so much for being here with me today on New Mexico in Focus. Let's go and start with Senator Lopez. Tell me a bit about what led to Senate Memorial 14 and why did you feel like this was necessary now?
There was a group of women that approached both Senator Pinto and I last summer. Elena Giacchi, who is a renowned, nationally recognized trainer in Indian country with regards to domestic violence, sexual abuse, and she, as well as Keely Badger, who's an attorney and works in Indian country also on many different issues and is a lawyer and has done much research with regards to reproductive justice in the United States and around the world, as well as Ms. Jean Whitehorse. But they approached us and gave us some background history as to the issue on reproductive justice, but forced sterilization of Indigenous women in our country. And the history that they shared with us, of course, too, is that they had just been in April of last year in front of the United Nations. And the United Nations at that point in time, last April, had a convening where there were other countries around the world who were present in sharing information about forced sterilization of their own Indigenous women in different countries around the world. So they came back after that presentation and had, I think, a renewed energy, interest, and seeing what New Mexico could be doing with regards to this particular issue. And so they approached both Senator Pinto and I and asked for us to learn more information, but asked if we would be interested in presenting this information as well as a potential memorial, a bill, a commission, whatever we would be able to introduce and get passed through the session to put New Mexico first in this country of ours about recognizing this serious issue.
And now, Senate Cedillo Lopez, I'm curious to know, what was the government's rationalization for forced sterilization historically?
Oh my gosh, historically, this country has always had an element of racism since its founding. And one place that you can really see it was Margaret Sanger. When she was pushing the birth control pills. We all see birth control pills as this really feminist innovation, and it was. It really helped a lot of women make a lot of choices about their lives. But her rationale and how she sold it was about eliminating undesirable people, it was very racist. And unfortunately, that racism permeated our medical system. And so not only do you see it happening with Native women, you see it happening with African American women, and you see it happening with, the reason I got in was because one of the first law review articles I worked on when I was at UCLA was an article written by Antonia Hernandez about the sterilization of Mexican American women in Los Angeles. So if you're Mexican American and if you were on public assistance, almost guaranteed you'd get sterilized when you went in to have your baby. It was horrible.
Wow.
It was horrible.
And how many of these do we know were carried out? You know, what's the impact did this practice have on Indigenous communities, but also, like you mentioned, Indigenous communities of color?
Well, the numbers are not known. That's one of the things that I think is really important. This little study examined, I forgot, is it Los Angeles Memorial Hospital? I forgot the name of the hospital, it's been a while. But there was a hospital that was kind of where everybody who was on public assistance went. And they did a study of those records. And what they found was a lot of sterilizations carried out without consent or without informed consent or, against women who spoke only Spanish and the documents were in English. And so they did this study. And like I said, two things. If you're on public assistance and you were Mexican American and you were in there to have a baby, almost guaranteed you would end up with a sterilization. It was really bad. So the percentage in that hospital was high, but that was one particular hospital in Los Angeles. So it's unknown how many women, I think that's the importance of the memorial.
Well, I don't think it's just the hospital. Well, so for example, in Gallup, there was a St. Mary's Hospital that I understand there was a birthing center there and during the 70s. And it closed and it turned to RMCH. But what happened with the records. How do we backtrack it? What happens when there's a turnover with these healthcare facilities? So I'm very curious, because that was just like 2 weeks ago. Someone was telling me they had their daughter there. And I was like, oh, there was a hospital there.
And I know this is interesting with this House memorial, you know, it was heard during the interim meetings, but also during this legislature. Senator Pinto, I'm interested to know, what did you hear from survivors or family members of survivors?
Well, certain women did come forward and tell us their stories that I don't feel is my place to retell. But it was very concerning and very emotional and very traumatic in some instances, not just a generational trauma, but, you know, the children now, I'm very concerned because even just last year, there was an organization, I went to a meeting and there was a resolution in there that they were going to put forward to the national legislature about kind of the birth control, but only for Indian Health Service hospitals for Native American teen pregnancy. They were the only ones listed. And I was like, why are we singling out just this entity, just only this population at this time of this day and age? It shouldn't be happening like that.
And now I know one of the most common issues back then was language barriers. Do we know if that's still an issue or are there other barriers?
Yes, we did have young lady come forward and tell of an incident of about a patient that came from the reservation because most of our care is referred out to specialists. And they came into Albuquerque and they were there for 4 days and they just needed a certain test to be done. But the patient only spoke Navajo and they never brought a translator in. My understanding is through IHS there is not really a record within their records saying that there needs to be a translator there. But I know with some work that Senator Lopez done that there is supposed to be some sort of mechanism in there for our healthcare facilities to have a translator and even funding.
And Senator Lopez, how exactly were these forced sterilizations carried out? What did doctors do or say to these patients?
Many times from the stories that we've heard is the patient would go in maybe for appendicitis or some other illness that they'd have to go in. They'd go in for that surgery that may have happened, needed to take place, but then inevitably there was another procedure that was taking place and they didn't find out until much later. And we don't know. Again, those are stories that have been shared. We had some during the interim that were shared with us. And I sincerely believe that once this memorial continues to unravel and we get some more organization and moving forward with it, I believe there's going to be many more stories coming forward. And I know some of the stories that we've heard too is, you know, there's one person, in fact, Jean Whitehorse, she has shared her story numerous times of where she had a daughter, but after this procedure, which she didn't know about, she was wondering why she couldn't have any more children. And again, after you go back and have another visit to the doctor for another illness or whatever it may be, you find out what happened. And if I may say also too is the issue on interpretation. It's an issue that affects both for our indigenous communities, especially for our elders, but also in Mexican American communities and others. We had stories shared with us too, even by one of our state representatives. She was in the state of New York, under stress, under duress, etc. If her husband hadn't read the list for what she was supposed to sign, she would actually have signed away her ability for reproduction.
So when we're talking about Native communities before colonialism, Senator Pinto, how were they different from settler communities in terms of structure? How were the gender roles different?
I think back then they were very specific. I mean, even today, you know, there's some ceremonies culturally that we do that only the women touch or are take care of, and then even the males, they do a certain aspect on that. And but when I think about this after colonialism, we already had women's health, reproductive. They already had some of the, like the doulas and stuff. These processes that they go through, and even the speaking, even the kinata, you know, that process and that speaking and the mentoring that would happen amongst the women. And I think it's very important. But I know, too, that you can't keep everything the same. There's some good parts you gotta, and then you gotta move along as far as technology and what's out there.
And what we're seeing now in most Indigenous communities is that they're run by men. What challenges does that impact for Native American women?
Well, I think in that aspect, when we talk about reproduction, because during COVID there was some issues with funding in the healthcare facilities, and the first thing that got cut was OBGYN department. And you know, when children decide to come into this world, I understand it is not, can't really be a set time. When they want to come, they're going to come, and so that's an emergency. But to have to go 2 more hours or 3 more hours to see an OBGYN or even get some special care when you're giving birth, I mean, when we talk about equal access, equal funding, talk about Title IX, some of these things that already exist for equality for women, why doesn't it exist for our healthcare funding?
So as Native Americans, we often continue to fight about sovereign lands, but what about the sovereign right to our bodies?
That is very essential, because even some of the mandatory treatment that they're trying to implement, I think there's a fine line there where you cross invading that and allowing the individual to have that right. And it goes, it's tough, because when we talk about the age where you should be able to make your own decisions, but there also should be that advocacy aspect where someone should be able to advocate for their child in that sense, if need be. And Senator Lopez, I believe there was some legislation that we were trying to make sure that there was not a crushing of the individual's rights.
Well, thank you so much to the three of you for being here. I'm going to ask you to stick around so we can take a look at Senate Memorial 14 more and how it relates to today.